Good morning, everyone. I'm Fifi Peters, and welcome to this very live CNBC Africa broadcast. Today, we're coming to you from the Gordon Institute of Business Science. So why, you might ask, are we here at Gibbs? Well, it's because we'll be analyzing the Gauteng budget that was delivered by the Finance MEC, Barbara Creecy, just yesterday. It's a 121 billion rand budget, and I know it came as no surprise to many of us that the bulk of that spending is going towards health and education, given recent developments in that sector. But there were also a few surprises, like a new highway that will be built in Gauteng very soon. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be getting into the analysis in just a bit and really asking, what does this budget mean for ordinary Gauteng citizens? How will it improve our lives? What does it mean for business, big and small? We're going to be answering these questions throughout the broadcast in just a bit. We will have a live panel discussions where we will be engaging various stakeholders on the matter. But of course, we can't talk about the Gauteng budget without hearing from the Finance MEC, Barbara Creecy herself. And it's at this point that I'd like to invite her on a stage to open up this morning's proceedings. MEC?
Thank you very much, Fifi, and good morning to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us here today. I thought just by way of introduction, I would speak a little bit about some of the challenges we face in constructing this budget. As all of you know, the overall budget was 121 billion. But as a result of the decisions taken at national level, we did face cuts, both to our equitable share and also to our conditional grants. And what this meant is that once again, we had to rely on our own revenue that we raise as a province to plug some of the holes that would inevitably result from the cuts. So we are predicting to raise about 6 billion in own revenue this year. We are also relying on the partnerships that we have with the private sector, as well as with civil society. We have service delivery partnerships that are bringing in about 400 million rands worth of goods and services into provincial government. We have the first of our 7 mega human settlements that we have launched, which collectively will provide about 80,000 housing units. Those mega human settlements have attracted in the region of 50 billion rand. And we also have our 7 PPPs with the Gauteng Infrastructure Financing Agency that are together with in the region of about 4 billion rand. So that is off-budget financing that would be contributing to the overall spend of the Gauteng provincial government. Just in terms of sources of our budget, you would understand that the big bulk of our budget comes from the national equitable share. Only 5% or less than 5% comes in the form of own revenue. Major source of own revenue is vehicle licenses, but we also include taxes on gambling licenses, liquor licenses, and also investments, the short-term investments that we make as provincial treasury. Where have we increased spending? What you can see, as Fifi has already said, is the big winners in this budget are health and education. Obviously, you would understand that in this province we have constant in-migration, which places an enormous burden on our social services. 250,000 people moving into this province each and every year. In January this year, MEC Lesufi confronting the fact that there were 50,000 learners who had not registered that arrived at Gauteng schools looking for a place. So you would see that we are having to compensate education for increases in learner numbers, and of course that has a knock-on effect on all the services that we provide in education. We need more teachers, more textbooks, more furniture, more for the school nutrition program, more for the scholar transport program. So 3.4 billion increase in the education budget. The health budget increasing by 4.4 billion. And I think that you all know last year Premier David Makhura appointed a subcommittee of the Executive Council to stabilize the finances in health. We've done an enormous amount of research on the health budget. What we now understand is the reason that we have not been able to deal with the accruals is underfunding of the personnel budget. The personnel component in the Department of Health has increased by 25,000 professionals over the last 10 years. And because that personnel budget has been underfunded, it's been eating out the budget for goods and services. So big increase to the personnel budget, but also a big increase to the goods and services budget. Other beneficiaries of this particular budget, social development, which receives overall 4.9 billion, very important for our war against poverty and for all different kinds of poverty alleviation mechanisms. And Department of Transport, Fifi, you mentioned the fact that this year Gauteng Provincial Government will start with the very first highway that has been built in this province since the 1970s. It's an east-west highway. You would know most of our highways go north-south. Starting at the Galulis interchange, really part of facilitating the development of the aerotropolis so that we open up the economic opportunities that exist around the fact that Gauteng is now becoming the biggest inland port in Africa, but also moving from there across to the West Rand so that we open up that western corridor, which moves to the Platinum Belt and ultimately to Botswana. You will see on the slide that there is a decrease in the budget for human settlements. The reason for that is the effect. I spoke earlier about the cuts in the conditional grants. And human settlements, by and large, their budget comes from conditional grants from national government. Nevertheless, human settlements remains, as you can see from this slide, which is really looking at the infrastructure spend. Human settlements still receives about 50% of the infrastructure spend in the province. Roads and transport, 2.2 billion this year, education, 1.6 billion. What we would be looking at here would be all of the infrastructure work that the Gauteng Provincial Government is doing, building schools, rehabilitating health facilities, upgrading of roads, and also other social facilities. This slide just gives you a sense over the medium term. So it's the 3-year projections, what we will be spending in each of our different corridors. You can see that the Western Corridor and the Southern Corridor, although they have smaller amounts, proportionately these are very large investments, and that really makes good on our ongoing commitment that we have to upgrade those particular corridors that are the most historically depressed areas in our province. Just to share with you the importance of the provincial government's infrastructure spend. We have spent 42.2 billion rand on building infrastructure over the past 4 years. This has been, I think, a very important contribution to our provincial economy in very tough economic times. We originally, 2 years ago, did an independent study on the impact of our infrastructure spend. We're now updating ourselves. But what we have found is that this spend has generated 26 billion rands worth of economic activity in our province. It's resulted in households receiving an additional 15 billion rand in income. It's generated 7 billion rand for government revenue. Unfortunately, it all goes to national. But it has, and I think this is the most important part of the story, it has created and sustained 95,000 direct jobs and 194,000 indirect and induced jobs. The other part of the story, which I want to share with you before I conclude, is how our goods and services budget has contributed to economic transformation. We have spent 57.7 billion rand over the last 4 years procuring goods and services from companies owned by historically disadvantaged individuals. Included in this, the total number of companies is 12,000 companies. Included in this is 7,500 companies owned by women, 5,500 companies owned by youth, and 2,100 companies owned by people living with disability. We have also, in that 57 billion rand, spent 17 billion rand procuring goods and services from township entrepreneurs. And we see that as being a very important contribution to building small and micro enterprises, which are the major source of employment, particularly for young people in our province. Last point is just, of course, in tough economic times, you have to make sure that what you have, you use prudently and in the most effective and efficient manner. What I can share with you today is all the municipalities in our province, we've recently heard, have now received unqualified audits for the 3rd year in a row. All provincial departments and entities have unqualified audits, with 2/3 having clean audits. 75 big projects have now passed through the open tender system, and our target this year is that all new procurement will go through open public adjudication. And I've spoken a little bit already about our plan to stabilize the Department of Health, that being a very important mechanism to make sure that this crucial and significant recipient of provincial finances does not destabilize the whole system. Let me pause there, and thank you very much, Fifi.
Thank you so much, MEC. Of course, that was Gauteng Finance MEC Barbara Creecy spelling out the details of the budget there, telling us tough times that we're in, but of course we do know that things are looking on the up. We had positive economic growth figures out yesterday. We're going to go to a quick break. When we return, we unpack Gauteng's new dawn budget in more detail. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to the CNBC Africa special. We are still at the Gauteng Institute of Business Science, where we are here this morning at this breakfast meeting to unpack the Gauteng budget. It's a 121 billion rand budget, and we are going to find out exactly how business can engage in this. I mean, Gauteng government is set on alleviating poverty in the province, creating jobs, and also creating opportunities for its citizens. We're about to get into that discussion and find out how we can benefit. With this panel, of course, we did hear from the MEC, Barbara Creecy, who joins us on stage. We're also joined by Nazir Esop, who is Deloitte Africa Public Sector Leader. Next to Nazir is Nicola Klein, who is the Dean of the Gauteng Institute of Business Science, who has, welcomed us into a humble home this morning. And of course, he's no stranger to the channel, Cass Kuvadia, MD of the Banking Association of South Africa. So let's get straight into it. And MEC, if you allow me to just ask some of the panelists here what they thought about the budget. You did describe it as being tough. You had to take a lot of spending cuts as a result of the situation we find ourselves in the South African economy. But Nazir, what was the budget like for you?
So for me, I think it's definitely aligned to the national budget, focusing around education, health, and social development. But also for me, I look at it, I say, look at the Gauteng budget. It's basically dealing with the challenges that the Gauteng province has had around the in-migration of people into the Gauteng province. The last stats I saw in November 2015, they said there was 14.2 million people just living in Gauteng. Now, if you look at the Stats SA's results was 11, almost, let's say 12 million people in 2011. Just in 4 years, okay, we've got over 2.5 million people that have migrated into Gauteng. And that's the challenge for the Gauteng province, is how do you manage a budget with all these challenges of, and the MEC touched on about 50,000 learners pitching up in the beginning of the year, no placement for them. So I believe that the budget is dealing with the challenges. It's really addressing the challenges. But also the beauty part of the budget is it's forward-looking as well. And there's a proactive approach from the Gauteng province. And I think that's complementary of the leadership, the Premier Makura and the MEC, looking at the future around building a highway. We've never had a highway since 1970. A new highway.
Since many of us in this room were even born.
Okay, so I think there's very complimentary, very proactive. And I also saw there was a part about in the budget that talks about a modernization program of about 1 billion rand over the next 3 years. To me, I would love to unpack that. I think that's great that the Gauteng province is taking that initiative around modernization, and that's purely around making the lives easy for citizens from a digital perspective, from a technology perspective, and how do we interact with the Gauteng province. So I think very positive budget, very well balanced, and I think there's lots of opportunities for citizens, opportunities for business. If I look at unpack the budget, I believe that the infrastructure spend will create lots of business opportunities for all companies in the Gauteng province.
Okay, so we'll get into those opportunities in just a bit. And Nicola Nazir says it was aligned to the national budget, which many have described as being a good budget, good enough to possibly even avert a ratings downgrade from Moody's later on this month. Your sentiments on the budget?
What struck me about this year's budget is its consistency. So we've seen enormous volatility at the national political level. What's very clear to me from the Gauteng budget, and this is the MEC's fourth budget that's being tabled, is it's predicated on a consistent strategy that is really looking at, when I look at a budget, I think there are three issues we really look at. The first is where do we spend? The second is who do we spend with? And the third is how effectively do we spend? And the Gauteng province has put into place a number of mechanisms that I think actually precede a lot of the discourse that's happening at national level now. So to me, it's not only that it's aligned with national budget. The point here is that it's consistent. Putting a business hat on, business doesn't like surprises. We like to see positive movements forward, but we don't like surprises. I don't think it's a full surprise budget, but having said that, I think it's an honest, open budget that balances how do you fly the plane today with how do you build the plane for tomorrow.
Okay, so your input, perhaps you can balance us with, you know, maybe any disappointments that you had in this budget, because it's all good so far.
No, I don't think I have any disappointments. I think the two speakers before me have alluded to expenditure going into the right areas, alluded to accountability, good administration, and so on. I think I just want to touch, because I think that we should remind ourselves that this budget, the national budget, SONA, the Gauteng Premier's speech, all occur at a time when we're coming out of an era that we should not underestimate has caused significant damage to our country, okay? And we're in a process now, or the beginning of a process of rebuilding what has essentially been destroyed. And I think what this budget is talking to is that. I think it's also important, the MEC in her budget referred to the year of Madiba. In the SONA, Mama Sisulu was referred to. And what that says is that we're now starting out, and the budgets indicate that, on a journey to say we need to be credible, we need to have values that actually talk to our responsibility to those we govern, and from a business point of view, our responsibility to those that we do business with. So I think things like partnerships with business is important. I think the message that meritocracy is important. I think we also need to move away from this, what I believe is not a very healthy narrative and continues to happen. So we talk here about equity and social justice. That's got to be within the context of growth. And the narrative has got to be not growth or transformation. The two go hand in glove. There can't be growth without transformation, because then if the majority of the people do not have a stake in the economy, you can't get to the 6-7% growth rates we need, let alone maintain them. And if we don't have growth, we can't have transformation. What are you transforming? So the two go hand in glove, and that narrative has got to come together. And transformation and transformative and inclusive growth is an imperative for all South Africans, not just previously disadvantaged South Africans.
No, for sure. And I mean, talking about growth, we did hear from a newly appointed Finance Minister, Ndlanhlenyana, saying that in October, when he delivers his medium-term budget, he expects to deliver much higher growth forecasts. We saw higher growth forecasts coming through yesterday, MEC, for the fourth quarter. You're looking to go and raise some 6 billion rands. I mean, in your speech, you say to the Premier, send me to Mamina, echoing the words of the President there. I mean, given the backdrop of possibly better growth for the South African economy this year, a better mood from business particularly, I mean, how do you think, or how easy do you think it will be to get business on board to partner with you to raise that money?
Well, I think that we already have significant private-public partnerships in the Gauteng Provincial Government. But obviously the key ingredient that has been missing over the last couple of years has been this thing that we call business confidence and consumer confidence. And I think what is so significant about the current mood is that we are seeing an upturn in business confidence and consumer confidence. We have very clear and very consistent plans as the Gauteng Provincial Government. We have a very clear economic development strategy. We have done a lot of work on identifying the 11 key sectors of the economy where we think that there can be growth. I think what has been missing for that process to take off has been the magic ingredient of confidence.
The cheapest form of stimulus, many describe it as. But Kaz, I mean, you're a man who talks to the people who hold a lot of money in this economy, the banks, you know. I mean, what do you foresee appetite from the banks being? MEC has already told us there's already partnerships in place, but for sure we could do with more. I mean, what would it take?
No, absolutely. And you know, banks, people keep on saying banks have all this money to invest. Well, they hold my money and your money. And essentially banks are, there's a saying, are the oil that actually greases the engine, which is the economy. Mm-hmm. Now, if conditions do not pertain for business to have the confidence to invest, then banks cannot actually fund anything, to be quite honest. So I think that doesn't mean banks sit back and wait for this to happen. In the last 3 or 4 years, we've been very active in things like the CEO initiative and so on, in trying to address the fundamental structural issues that's actually holding back confidence, business confidence, for a period of time, hold back downgrades, which then we couldn't hold back further.
Possibly maybe the end of this month.
So I think that the MEC is right. I think that the changes in the last few months has raised confidence. Business is beginning to feel a bit more confident. We've got a little bit of growth. And I think those are all bricks that we can use to rebuild. And on the back of that, banks will. Banks are absolutely committed to do what they do best in providing the products, the services, structuring the finance and all of that to actually facilitate the growth of the economy. Because they're doing that in other parts of the continent and other parts of the world, because they haven't been able to do it here because of the environment. Mm. So they'll come back home, not that they have left, but they'll do much more here, and there's an absolute commitment that we will want to do that.
And Nicola, you want to add to that?
I want to add, Fifi, because I want to challenge us on the back of the MEC's budget speech about who we think of when we talk about business. So there's an aspect of big business, they hold purse strings, they lubricate economies. But if we look, part of our challenge as a country is to make sure that we're more inclusive around who we define business. So when we start looking at the strategy around small business, township economies, I think we've got to be very careful that we're not talking about business as only big concentrated, maybe I should avoid the word white monopoly, but big concentrated business. Yeah. Business is that engine that drives economic growth, and we have to see less concentration. So I want to encourage us, when we run a business school here, the danger for us is that we only think of business as those JSE listed companies. And so when we talk business, I want to encourage all of us to think the broader view of who business is.
No, for sure. And I mean, everybody knows small businesses have been touted as being the growth engines of the economy. They're likely to employ the most people, and we do know we need to bring our unemployment rate down. It's way too high. But Nazir, for a person who I imagine you consult a lot with business, perhaps big and small, you know, that engage a lot with the public sector in terms of doing work. What are your concerns here for those wanting to perhaps do more work but are a bit cautious about putting in more cash?
Yeah. Look, I think there was a business sentiment from the private sector around, there was actually a trust deficit between private sector and public sector. I think that trust deficit, as Kes has mentioned, is starting to change, as we've seen as well. The business sentiment is becoming more positive. I think you'll even see that from a global perspective, that there would be a positive sentiment towards doing business with public sector now, going forward. And I think we need to look at how do we incorporate, how do we become an inclusive country where we bring in small business. So take big business and partner them with small business, okay? And let's go together to work with public sector. So we're seeing the new procurement rules saying at least 30% of these large bids must be incorporating a smaller BE partner, which I believe is the right thing to do. I mean, if government's spending 500 billion rand a year on goods and services, at least government needs to drive the agenda. And I think that's positive. But I also think the comment around business being, they need to play their part. Okay, we sit and we always criticize government. Okay, we say we are where we are because government failed in terms of what it did. My view around is working with private sector and government is that I believe private sector needs to play its part. There's always two parties to something that goes wrong. If you look at the level of corruption, the level of maladministration that took place within public sector, it happened with private sector. It didn't happen on its own. Government contracts and does business with private sector. So I think the private sector people need to come to the party as well and say, look, if we're going to be doing business going forward, we need to do it in the right spirit, in the right spirit of the law, in the right spirit of bringing, including smaller players, driving the right agenda for the country so that we all benefit from the spend of government.
No, for sure. I mean, MEC, what's the plan there in, bringing down corruption? We've got this broom that's sweeping across the entire economy, trying to clamp it out. But what's the plan, particularly for the big ticket items here, like the highway? What's the plan?
Look, I think our innovation around irregular expenditure has been the open tender process. And it's something that we've worked on over the last 4 years. It allows for the open public adjudication of tenders. And it's a very interesting mechanism because what it does is it allows all the competing bidders to sit there while the decision is being made, so that all of them understand who is being awarded and why are they being awarded. Now, it's had some unintended spin-offs. I think one of the unintended spin-offs is that it's dramatically reduced the number of tenders that land up in court because people feel that they were unfairly adjudicated. And when a tender lands up in court, there are obviously very, very long delays, and sometimes it has to be rerun, and that impacts particularly on tenders in the built environment. And ultimately on the infrastructure spend. I think the other unintended consequence is that it's been a process of public education. And I say to all small companies that want to do business with government, go and watch that adjudication process, because you will learn how to do business with government. You will learn what government is looking for. Of course, it hasn't been without its complexities for us. We've now completed training of over 1,068 supply chain officials across the province. It's been a huge undertaking. We've had our own complexities as Provincial Treasury in terms of the probity audits. We've had to increase our own management capacity. But I'm looking forward later this year, we will table a bill in the Gauteng Provincial Legislature so that we enshrine this reform in law, because I think that we don't want it to be something that happened in this term and then it disappears. We want it to be the way to go going forward, because ultimately, unless you engage in these processes, I don't think that you're going to be able to restore public confidence in government procurement.
I mean, MEC, let's actually touch on the highway now. I mean, I can imagine a lot of people, particularly in the construction space, who are excited about this one. But who's it for? Can small business engage?
Well, I think Nazir's already made the point that it's now legislated that 30% of any contract over 30 million rand has to be subcontracted to small businesses. I think one of the things that we are finding as provincial government is because we don't appoint those small contractors, the JV has to happen before the bidding process. It's not without its complexities, and I think more and more work is going to need to be done by the departments in the built environment to make sure that that subcontracting happens, that it is verifiable, and also that it's bringing in more and more new players. We're doing lots of work in supplier development, so we're trying to screen businesses, we're trying to advertise them to public and private sector partners. But obviously, in the end, it's up to the private sector to come to the party and make sure that they set up those JVs with 30% being small enterprises and, of course, township enterprises being the #1 target from our perspective.
And of course, women. I mean, we will be celebrating International Women's Day tomorrow. It's about including them as well. I mean, at this point, I'd like everyone to start thinking about questions, and we'll be coming to the floor soon for that. But Kaz, staying with the issue of transport, Gauteng government now agreeing that e-tolls are just not working, and they're looking for a way to, I don't know, do away with them. I don't know if that's the correct terminology. But I mean, we've got a lot of private sector individuals who have got a lot of debt, you know, via holding SANRAL bonds and the like. I mean, how do you do away with that system that, you know, makes motorists happy, but also doesn't dent the balance sheet of banks in particular too much?
Yeah, look, when the Gauteng government says that, I don't think they're going to, at the stroke of a pen, I don't think they mean that at the stroke of a pen they're going to bring down all the e-toll gantries. I think there's been problems around the e-tolls, okay? We need to deal with them. If we want to phase them out, then we've got to take into account the value chain that needs to be addressed, including banks and others that have commitments there and that have exposures there, and we need to do that in a responsible way, which I'm sure is the intention. So I think what we need to do is we need to engage on these things, and if a government takes the decision to do a particular thing, then I think government needs to engage with the value chain, see how we do it so that there's minimal impact on the economy and on our ability to continue to engage and fund public projects. So I'm sure that we'll engage on that and we'll do it properly. And so we'll wait for the process to start and then we'll engage.
I think most of us believe you because we do know we've got a president who actually likes to engage. I mean, he settles matters with negotiations at that. But Nazir, I mean, health and education, so priority areas here. A lot of interest from private sector in the health and education space. I mean, I need not mention, I'm sure a lot of you are aware in the room. The issue is health and education departments, also the departments that, you know, don't necessarily pay people on time, quite a high record for that. I mean, your advice to the government in fixing this?
Look, I think there's a number of challenges, and I think the MEC also mentioned in the speech around, for example, the Gauteng Department of Health, around its challenges around paying its supplies on time. But I guess if you look at the rest of the Gauteng province, I mean, there's positive results. I think they're paying 93% of its supplies within 30 days. So within
15.
15, okay, 15 days. So you know, it's not like it's not possible. I think if you replicate what has been done in other departments, for me it's a leadership issue. It's a matter of applying what has been done successfully in one department and replicating to another department. So I don't think there's a challenge for business to do for private sector to do business with public sector. I think it can work. And I think it goes both ways. I think if private sector delivers on time, issues the documentation on time, make sure that that the goods have been delivered and the services have been rendered at the right levels, government will pay.
I mean, Nicola, for a business school, I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs and business people that come here, the small business people in particular, as I picked up, that's a passion of yours. I mean, how do you make them, or your advice to ensure that they are ready to engage in bigger projects like this with the Gauteng government and not to qualify by virtue of them being a small business?
It's not a question of there's no money available to fund enterprise development and small business development, both from the Gauteng budget. And let's not forget here that this budget represents, as I understand it, 10% of our Gauteng economy. So it's a critical flywheel in it, but there's another 90% that is held in other hands. So for me, the issue is how are we working together to ensure that we are collectively offering entrepreneurs and small businesses access to development. As a business school, it's been something that we started off with a lot of large corporate clients. As we've grown our spread, it's working with organizations to ensure that we're growing entrepreneurs. The thing where I think there's work to be done is there are pockets sitting in various funds. I mean, the banking sector sits on significant funds here. I don't know that there's an accessible flow of information. And I don't think that we've been as good as we can all be about communicating where these opportunities for entrepreneurs lie. So there's a dislocation in information. It's not that there's no money in the system. It's clearly there.
So at this point, if anybody does have any questions, could you please raise your hand? And I think mics will come around to you. Could you also stand? Okay, I see two hands there at the back. And just introduce yourself, tell us where you're from, and then we can start with the questions.
Good morning. My name is Colin Hans. I'm from Josie FM, local community radio stations. What I want to understand from the MEC, because yesterday she even alluded to the fact that sometimes you do not understand how the province works towards the local governance, like your cities. Now we have a budget that is tabled, and you find that when it comes down to the cities, there comes a problem. Because of maybe it will be imperative that the MEC now explains that this budget, as they are playing they oversee the conditional grants that are given to the city. You find that this budget, we need to understand that if it's a case of housing towards a city, whose responsibility is it that funding must be found? Like a typical example, there will be budgeting for housing, but when it comes to the city, you find an excuse like it's not our competence. We're actually given less money so we cannot actually be blamed for not building houses in that area. Maybe the MEC can then now explain to us to say, how do we see to it that budgets are going to allocated spaces and without being rechanneled into different spending unnecessarily? Meaning we are looking for a measure to say, how do you measure to say that if I gave 3 billion as an example towards housing in the city of Johannesburg, how do you measure that it is actually allocated and used relevantly towards what you earmarked for?
Let me see, perhaps some clarity on that.
Yeah. Look, I think the important thing we all need to understand is we have 3 levels of government in our country. The municipal sphere of government, or the cities, it's a sphere in its own right. It receives grants. It receives a portion of the equitable share from national government. It also receives conditional grants from national government. I suppose the real issue is how do you get your 3 levels of government to move in the same direction at the same time? Because when we're talking about housing projects, the Gauteng Department of Housing would receive the money to build the top structures, so the houses, or to service the sites. But municipalities are responsible for putting in the bulk infrastructure, and they receive money from national government in order to do that. Where I think the problem lies is that you may not always have synergy in terms of where the cities decide to work on bulk infrastructure and where the provincial government decides it wants to build houses. And I think that over the years there have been some bad examples of cooperative governance, which no doubt, Nicola, your students study, where you've built top structures without bulk and you've built bulk without top structures. So it's really about trying to get synergy in that regard. And I suppose government is notorious for silos. And silos go this way and that way.
And hopefully that's something that can get fixed under this new dawn that we're talking about. But can we take some more questions? Can I just ask that we just keep the questions as short, as succinct as possible so everyone can get an opportunity?
Thank you. My name is Ali Khodolo. I'm from Gauteng Business Solutions, an SMME company in the ICT space. Minister, MEC, you mentioned the 57 billion that you spent in the previous financial year, and you categorized SMMEs that have benefited from that. However, I've got an interest in understanding how much of that 57 billion went to those SMMEs. And the second question is around the SMMEs and set-asides in Gauteng. What are you setting aside for SMMEs in Gauteng? And how can we benefit from this budget as SMMEs in various spaces? Thank you.
MEC?
Well, the 57 billion is goods and services spend over the past 4 years. I think the total goods and services spend is somewhere in the region of 59 billion. So the 57 billion is what has been spent on procuring goods and services from historically disadvantaged individuals. So we pride ourselves on the fact that 95–96% of our goods and services spend is spent on procuring from companies owned by historically disadvantaged individuals. So the answer is all of it went to companies owned by historically disadvantaged individuals. I think that at the moment, procurement legislation does not allow set-asides. That is the new legislation that Treasury has indicated they are going to table in March. We're looking forward to it. What we can do at the moment, and what we do at the moment, is all spending under 500,000 can only be spent on procuring goods and services from township entrepreneurs. So nobody else can go into that space, only township entrepreneurs. But that doesn't mean that township entrepreneurs can't participate in the space above 500,000. And that's why we are currently working on what we call the pipeline prototype model. So what we want to understand is, how do you get a startup into the government procurement space? How do you empower that startup with financial and non-financial support? How do you give it access to government markets? And how do you exit it from government procurement into the big wide world, where it becomes a self-sustaining enterprise with a range of business partners in the private sector? And what we want to do is we want to develop a model like that. We want all Gauteng departments to buy into that model and to participate in that model, because the problem that we have now is not getting the enterprises into the system and into the support. We've got 9,500 township enterprises on the central supplier database. We've used half of them. But the issue is, how do you transition the ones that are quite successful out of government procurement into being self-sustainable in the private sector space, so that you can take new ones into the government procurement system? So it's that pipeline that we're working on at the moment. We're going to have a supplier development workshop later this year so that we can bring everybody on board into how we think this model should be functioning much more effectively than it is at the moment.
So look out for that workshop. But I think I understand that the national budget has allocated around 2.1 billion rand to an SMME fund. So maybe just research a little bit more about that. So the last question that we're going to take for this round, and then we'll come back to the stage and then take another round of questions a bit later. So.
Hi everyone. I am Tulani Ngwenya. I'm from Bytecode Digital, a digital innovation company. It's also an SMME. MSc, my issue or challenge is that obviously this is not the first promise made to SMMEs about we will do this and this and this for SMMEs, right? So I want to say to Mamina to go work with your people to ensure that what you're promising SMMEs actually happen. Because one of the challenges is, especially with the AD funding that you make available, you tend to appoint a company that you will then send all your SMMEs to. What the company does is they Google material, they train the SMMEs on the material that is Google, and they show you some workshops that they've ran with the SMMEs, and they're saying we've spent 10 million empowering these SMMEs. But these SMMEs are left worse off than before. They still don't have access to markets, right? That's issue number one. So the question there would be, how will you change that? Because as my colleague has asked here, how do you ensure that the funds that you've made available have actually empowered the SMMEs? They have not just been spent with SMMEs, but they've actually empowered SMMEs, right? The second question...
Sorry, so I'm going to have to cut you in there, but we will have another round of questions and you can proceed there. So how are you going to ensure that the funds allocated for SMMEs actually empower them, MEC?
Well, I guess the proof of the pudding is in the eating. At the beginning of this term, we were working with 600 township entrepreneurs a year. We are now procuring from 4,500. So, of course, we will never procure from everybody who wants us to procure from them. But I think that what we've got to convince ourselves of as government is, are we making progress in terms of getting more people into the system, buying more goods and services from those people, but more importantly, can we push them out the other side? And that's why I was speaking about the prototype, so that we can get others in. Because I think that part of what constrains us from bringing more in is that when you go into the private sector space, and this deals with the point you were making earlier about, is the private sector coming to the party? The private sector does an enormous amount of empowerment work with enterprises, but the private sector has no target for procurement from those enterprises. And I think that if we're looking at reform that's going to actually get this pipeline to work, what we've got to be looking at is private sector targets for procurement in the same way that we have targets for procurement.
Thank you, MEC. Let's just wrap up now. We've got about 4 minutes to wrap up this discussion right now. So closing comments from everyone. Kaz, I mean, private sector targets there, what do you make of that?
No, I think that we've absolutely got to work with the MEC and with the Gauteng government to actually ensure, and I agree with Nicola, that we can't just have big business. We've got to create the environment for small businesses to actually thrive, and big business has got to play a role in that with government. So for argument's sake, we're working with the Economic Development Department on a pilot project in Shemda on the motor industry. And those sorts of things need to happen. And we need to understand as business that it's in the interest of all of business to actually promote and develop small and medium business. And we certainly will continue to work with them on that.
Nicola?
A comment about businesses' role in national and provincial agendas. And this is really courtesy of Kaz, because we were having a conversation beforehand. Business has become quite vocal in the last couple of years, particularly around issues around corruption, what they see as issues of governance. There are changes at the national level. There should be some oxygen in the form of growth. If business stops trying to work with government and all of the stakeholders to tackle the major issues around social justice in this country, it will be a terrible loss. So while business has to focus on growth, it has to also, to your point, I want to underscore that, if they lose their focus on collaborating with government to achieve the transformation that this country needs, it would be a tragedy. So that's my plea to business.
And Nazif, final
I
thoughts?
think closing comments. I think, again, the common theme is collaboration. There needs to be collaboration. There needs to be more sessions like this, dialogue sessions, where government interacts with private sector, so that we can deal with the challenges. I mean, we're hearing some of the challenges around SMMEs. How do we make it, how do we resolve these challenges? And the best way to do it is to engage with each other, collaborate.
Well, it's on that note that we will leave it. And SMEC, you want to have a final thought?
Working together, we can do more.
For sure. Well, that is where we leave the live broadcast of the Gauteng budget, the 121 billion rand budget that will take us through the 2018-2019 financial year. Thank you so much for watching, and it's bye from us here at Gibbs.
Hey, Mr. Iggy.
Hi, good morning. Very well, thank you.
No, thank you. Please, can we quickly check it? We're about to go live.